Hello and welcome to another episode of Ontological Shock. I'm Nathaniel Voss.
Shinobi Adept, Darkness, and Death. And welcome to the desert of the real.
So, what's on the agenda?
The agenda today is to talk about how minds like ours can thrive in this dystopian hellscape, maintaining some semblance of sanity, and cultivate emotional strength and growth. Especially, a lot of us are separated from each other, and we're surrounded by people who kind of want to go along with the matrix and don't care about these spiritual imperatives that drive us, right? And it's hard. They draw you back into their world, their world of, we always rail against consumerism. But it's real, these people, most people only care about fucking football, Christianity, or hedonism. And that is not enough to grow a human being, especially after you've gone through these apostasies where you've cast aside all your belief systems and you're trying to recreate yourself. And you need a community. I've always envied the Christians because they have these large social networks. They care for each other and they help each other monetarily, spiritually, emotionally. And human beings have evolved to be social creatures. We need that. And we don't really have, and once you step outside of these paradigms, you don't really, what exists for us, if you're, if you're into the occult, if you're into Buddhism, what have you, there are far less smaller communities, and this kind of robust social structure does not exist for much of us. So the question here is how to stay afloat in this despair. A lot of us work jobs that are miserable, not paid enough, you're not given health care, yada, yada, yada. And that is opposed to its own problems in addition to the despair that a lot of us feel when just walking down the fucking street.
Mm-hmm. So, can you elaborate on what you mean when you say the words dystopian hellscape?
Dystopian hellscape. We talked about consumerism. Consumerism being the spiritual impetus of society. You go to your job, you're alienated from your home, you're alienated from your friends. You do your job, your boss doesn't fucking care about you. You have these very alienated, distant relationships with maybe your coworkers. And everybody's out for themselves at the end of the day, And that's not human, that's anti-human. And it hurts. People don't realize it, but it does. And a lot of people have this jaggedness, this edge to their spirit. And you can feel it when you talk to them. How people, I only care about this job. Fuck that person. A lot of things are disposable, especially human relationships. And this creates this vast network of human beings who are disaffected and only look to each other for exploitative purposes. And if that's not a formula for dystopia, nothing is. The air's poison. I don't have to enumerate all of the ecological catastrophes that we're seeing everywhere. Lead in the water of a lot of these poor communities. These things go unaddressed by governments because they don't care, because it's about the individual We've elevated the individual to be the only thing that matters. And so there is no thought of the communal. The communal suffers, and we all suffer.
How much of what
I suffer.
How much of what you're saying would you attribute to being a property that's distinctive of the modern world, and how much of it do you think is an endemic aspect of the human condition?
Okay. The human condition part, well, that's going to happen. But, let's talk about these social structures and how they create people, right? Human beings, for thousands of years, lived in more or less, not accordance, but in kind of symbiosis with nature. And now there's a idea, maybe it's always been this idea, that it's man versus nature, right?
Well, nature
human survival
is hostile and deadly.
It is.
The condition of human beings since before we were aware that we were human beings has been one of a struggle to exist.
But we've conquered nature almost completely, and we've reshaped the surface of the planet to our whim. And there's still so much suffering, so much unhappiness. There was a study done, I think, in the 50s that said in the U.S., our national happiness peaked in the 50s and has been going down. And, wealth is kind of a diminishing return. The more you get, it only helps so much. And there's still this sort of dissatisfaction, which could be more of, endemic of human suffering from a kind of a Buddhist thing. But definitely, let's go back to talking about how the poverty of a lot of places, right? How much of the world lives on less than $1 a day?
What is it, like half?
It's something. It's insane. These numbers are insane. So many people live in abject poverty, and if your basic needs are not met, right, you can't even really think about happiness or even talk about happiness if you're starving.
I'm going to take a counterintuitive route into this discussion. I'd like to speak for a minute about Diogenes. As people in the audience may or may not know, Diogenes was described as sort of like a Socrates gone mad.
A saint of the gutter.
Yeah, he lived in the street. He ate the things that were discarded by other people. He rejected every norm of society. And I'll tell an anecdote about him before I get to my main point, which, of course, you know. And there are different versions of this story. But Diogenes was once approached by Alexander the Great.
I love this.
Mm-hmm. And it's possible that Alexander asked him, "What can I do for you?" Or, "You have some teaching for me." And basically, Diogenes was like, "Get out of my light." Something I didn't know until I brought this up to Elliot the other day was allegedly when Alexander the Great walked away, he said, "If I were not Alex, I would wish to be Diogenes."
Ooh, damn.
Yeah, and that's something.
It's a lot of freedom in living outside of society. If you truly live outside and you take on this ignominy, you live in the trash. You don't have to go along with what everybody is saying. You definitely, when you make your own rules, you don't have to, get a job, as it were. You don't have to have these kind of normal social relationships, and it's like complete freedom to go and do as you please. That's probably what Alexander really envied, because the more power you have, the more kind of restrictive that is.
Remember in Fight Club when they say the queen bee is the slave? Well, check this. Where I was going to go is that people there's a weird critique of Diogenes that I think I brought up recently, which is the accusation that Diogenes and his kind of radical renunciation that he was exemplifying and teaching is actually elitist. Now, that sounds entirely self-contradictory on first blush, but the substance of the criticism is that if everyone were to live like Diogenes, there would be no society from which you could scour garbage. And thus, it is something which is necessarily the province of the few. Now, the reason I'm talking about this is because I would like to consider what you're saying so far in the light of the fact that human beings have achieved a level of security and prosperity which overshadows anything in previous history. And the world was something we were at the mercy of, and now it's at our mercy to the point where we could very well destroy ourselves in the process of destroying the world.
Very soon.
You know, they say that the nature, that book, The Key, by Whitley Strieber, they say that the nature of evil is to kill the host and ultimately itself. And
complete self-destruction.
It comes to mind.
So evil is self-destruction.
In the same book, it says that entropy is the tendency of all things to disintegrate, and evil is the addition of intention to that process. But what I'm thinking about, and this is getting off topic, but how Agent Smith levels that accusation against Morpheus when he's interrogating him, where he says that human beings are a disease, a cancer of this planet. And he says he thought about it and he realized you're not actually mammals. And basically he concludes that we're a type of virus.
The smell, that monologue was so powerful.
Such a thing.
Yeah. And he touches his face and he smells the sweat and you can see the disgust in his face. It's so powerful.
And then he exemplifies something that I think is really endemic of the human condition, because he says he clutches Morpheus's head in his hands and he says, I must get out. I must get free. This place is a prison. He's like, in this mind is the key, my key. Now think about that in connection with how human beings throughout religious history have been seeking to escape from time and matter into eternity. And that is a pattern we see in places as diverse as the Gnostic aspiration to ascend past the archons. We see it in certain variations of Buddhist soteriology in which one seeks to become free of the wheel of birth and death.
Death is a constraint.
Yes. And in the beginning of The Invisible Landscape, Terence McKenna says that liberation has been the raison d'etre of every religious and political movement that there has ever been. It has been a quest for liberation. And you know, people who used to either fight wild animals to survive or do back-breaking labor for 15, 16 hours a day might hear us bitching about the modern world and feel like there's something profoundly ahistorical and anachronistic and privileged about it. And yet, nevertheless, I don't disagree with you, but I want to add this context so that we can clarify it further.
They also had communities, right? Community doesn't really exist, and the capitalism all but destroyed the communal. And you know, when you're fighting against a wolf pack for your survival, you know, that must build intense trust and love between people. Like, what do we have? You work at some sort of corporation that doesn't care about you, with people who also hate their job, incompetent management. There's no...
The only thing we share in common is alienation.
Exactly. And as social creatures, we need that. So they can't a person living in that sort of hostile environment cannot even imagine such alienation and what its effects would be on the human psyche and how detrimental that would be for our society.
I think part of the problem is that we have managed to transform our environment more rapidly than evolution changes us. And we still have the neural circuitry that corresponds to when we were hunter-gatherers.
That's a big dissonance.
Yes, it is. And it's part of the reason why people tend to overreact to emotionally challenging situations. They'll regard these things as if they were existential, life and death things. It's also part of the reason why people tend to overvalue the perception of other people who play a very minor role in their life. I have heard that the reason for that has to do with the fact that throughout most of history, you never really associated with more than 150 people. And that is, they have found mathematically, psychologically, that's the maximum number of relationships that a person can effectively track and actively engage with. And we have this wiring that says, that feels like the social repercussions of when we embarrass ourselves with a stranger are going to affect our life. Because if there were only like 36 people in your village, it would have. Every instance of humiliation or misunderstanding would have had a ramification with which you would have had to live.
Because you're working and living so intimately.
Yes, and this is just one example of how there is a disconnect between the way that we're wired and the world that we've created. In our mythology, we say that we are created in God's image. But now, as part of that ongoing aspiration to be as God, we have created the world in our image. And we don't understand our image. We don't understand our nature.
What do you mean by our image?
Well, what I mean by that is that we're creating a reality that seems to serve human purposes, but we wind up serving its purposes. Systems get away from us, and they become almost autonomous. We were talking in the last episode about corporations, and I think it's kind of interesting to think about corporations almost like egregores. And,
And an egregore is?
Thank you for asking. I was going to elaborate on that because I figured people wouldn't know. An egregore, the way I've heard it explained in, well, I think this will do it. An egregore is a concept from esoteric sort of occult philosophy that refers to either A, the spirit of a group, or B, an entity which is created out of the collective focus of attention and belief. And
kind of a collective psychic energy.
Yeah. Now consider, entities like Citibank have legal personhood, but they also have autonomy because the will of the institution is independent of the will of the people who make it up, because the institution has systemic priorities that may be independent of the personal priorities.
And the corporations outlast the owners and members, which is kind of a rotating staff or whatever.
Now, like magical occult entities, they have sigils. And those sigils kind of concentrate collective attention and belief into an image. And often they have avatars like the Michelin tire creature. So
all manner of abominable corporate mascots that we've been forced upon us in commercial advertising.
Yeah, and I saw in some documentary that there were children who recognized Ronald McDonald more readily than they recognized a bunch of people from history. And there were some test subjects, some children, to whom the image of Ronald McDonald was more familiar than Jesus Christ.
Hail Satan.
Shem. It's haunting.
Yeah, that's terrifying.
And that's real demonology. Or
Especially-
that's a new form
wow.
of demonology.
Especially taking that McDonald's is just this giant corporation that makes basically bad food that's bad for you. And everybody knows it's kind of bad for you. And no one cares. And it has this sway in the collective mind.
Did you ever see the new comedy version of Dark Shadows?
No.
It's funny. When the vampire Barnabas Collins rises up out of his imprisonment, he walks back to find his estate, and he comes upon the golden arches of McDonald's, and then he shudders with terror and says, Mephistopheles.
I remember you telling me that. That's great.
That was a good moment.
I have a question. Going back to Diogenes.
Yeah.
Diogenes is living on the fringes of society.
He's like an agori. He's like a Western agori.
But why did he not leave society and, actually go? It seems like he had so much contempt for it. Why didn't he just go to the forest?
Because he'll die of exposure. People who went into the forest in India, there was a social configuration that sort of supported that. There was a lineage of wisdom of like, okay, if you're going to build a hut in the forest and you're going to live off of meager this is how you do it. And you learn that from, look, it's easy to die of exposure.
Hell yeah.
And it depends on the environment. Like Terence McKenna says, you can die, you can starve in the Amazon, despite the fact that you're surrounded by life, because it's a climaxed ecosystem in which every evolutionary niche is filled. So protein, if you leave it on the ground, it'll be gone in 3 minutes, that kind of thing.
But what do you think about like these hagiographies of like these Buddhist masters, which tell of them attaining these psychic powers so they can like shapeshift into rocks to survive the attacks of wild animals, or people living on nettle soup. That's not really survival skills in the kind of traditional sense.
Yeah, I read a book called The Psychology of Buddhist Tantra by this guy Rob Priest, and he talked about doing a Vajrayana retreat in the wilderness. And one of the things he did as part of the setup for his retreat was he created a magical circle of consecrated stones.
Oh, yeah.
The purpose of which was to keep away tigers. It was a good story, too, because he had this psychotic break midway through after he was having like these feverish like fixations on, I think it was Vajrayogini. He said there was some female Yidam he was working with. And a Yidam is a meditational deity in Vajrayana Buddhism, which is a kind of magical, esoteric version of Buddhism that uses ritual and archetypal imagery in order to try to get enlightened.
And Vajrayogini is a particularly beautiful, idealized female form.
Yeah, and she's naked, etc. But anyway, he has this fucking psychotic break, or it's this breakdown, and he like climbs down the mountain to go confront his master. And the master was like, "What are you doing here? Don't you understand? There are other people who pray to be experiencing what you're experiencing now, and you're here to complain about it. You should go back and sweat it out." But speaking to the substance of your question, it's hard to tell what the real boundaries of supernormal abilities really are. Mm-hmm. I think that there is solid empirical reason to believe that the mind has capacities other than those that are acknowledged in the default paradigm. But it's hard to say exactly how far that stretches.
You mean the paradigm of like scientific materialism?
Yeah. I mean, look, for example, there's a parapsychology experiment that shows that people have the capacity to recognize images a couple seconds in the future, and they can recognize it better if the image is either threatening or if it's like very sexual in nature. And people are able
Sex and violence.
Yeah, well, those are things that are integral to survival. Mm-hmm. So that kind of indicates that this precognitive capacity, however seemingly weak it might be something that was shaped by natural selection, because those
psychic ability,
those two types of stimuli, right? Mm-hmm. I don't really have a clear idea of what I think the mechanism for those types of abilities would be. I think the clearest that I can think about them is to think about them as anomalies. Anomalies in the sense that they are challenges around which we will have to refine our paradigm. Famously, Lord Kelvin quipped that there were two clouds on the horizon of physics.
Who's Lord Kelvin?
He's this scientist
person.
And there were just little minor technical problems, and once they were resolved, physics would be complete. And those two minor little problems turned into relativity and quantum mechanics, respectively. They turned into a completely different paradigm, a revision in our concept of what reality is, how it works, what's possible, what our place is in it. I think that similarly, psychic phenomena and other paranormal things, that some of the capacities that are demonstrated by these apparently non-human intelligences, which are from elsewhere, those represent clouds on the horizon. And if these beings are from space, as opposed to elsewhere in time or some other aspect of reality that we don't have the conceptual vocabulary for, then that suggests that it's possible to travel at hyperluminal velocities, or it suggests that it's possible to move in different directions along the time dimension, or both. So these anomalies, I think, represent challenges. And with the way that theory works is when you have an anomaly, you don't want to have to throw out your whole theory. Think of that as being expensive. If you have an anomaly...
Baby out with the bathwater?
Yeah, it's better to modify one of the ancillary hypotheses as opposed to taking out the whole picture. Because if you take out the whole picture, you get rid of the explanatory utility that picture gives you. And scientific progress is kind of a balancing act between those. We do have counterindications of how psychic phenomena may or may not work. Like, people have tried things that seem to falsify the possibility that it is because of an electromagnetic field. We have found that these results obtain with equal efficacy regardless of how far away somebody is. It was even tried on the moon. One of the astronauts informally volunteered for a parapsychology experiment while they were on one of the Apollo missions. And so I think it has to do with non-locality and entanglement, but that is a very, very vague answer. All of this, though, is by way of saying that I think there are things that are possible through the cultivation of conscious attention, of the capacities of the mind when it is concentrated, and when the mind really understands itself, which is kind of tantamount to understanding reality in this paradigm, when it becomes transparent to itself.
This paradigm as an occult paradigm or a Buddhist?
I mean, I'm kind of presupposing my own sort of generalized interdisciplinary synthesis of a variety of occult paradigms and mystical paradigms that, seems to pass the smell test of internal coherence and stuff like that. Because really what you start getting into when you start trying to think about this in detail is speculative metaphysics. And, one of the crises of my philosophical career, well, not even really philosophy, one of the crises that philosophy brought to me in my overall spiritual effort to understand the nature of consciousness and understand the nature of reality was leveled by kind of collectively a trio, Hume, Kant, and Wittgenstein. And each one of them, in different ways, effectively laid a prohibition against the viability of metaphysics. Kant says, I'll put it in Kant's terms. He says that metaphysics can't work because it's about things that are beyond the scope of possible experience.
We can't ever check them.
Yeah, how would we ever know if there's a God? How would we ever know whether there was a beginning to the universe? The thing is...
kind of like you can't... how do you know if time is real? You can't step outside of it to verify or something like that or do any sort of test.
Yeah, and when I was reading this, I kind of got stuck for a while. And it wasn't clear how to move forward if I were going to continue to seriously entertain a lot of these notions about, esotericism and magic and spiritual practice. And the way through, or the beginning of a suggestion of the way through, came to me through Wilbur. And that's why I got really thrilled about Wilbur when I started reading him. He says the problem with this kind of anti-metaphysical position, and granted, he thinks of himself as being post-metaphysical, but for more subtle reasons than what I'm talking about. The problem with that kind of thing is that it doesn't acknowledge the fact that the scope of possible experience can be expanded. The scope of possible experience can be expanded. For example, Kant thought that we couldn't know whether there was a beginning to time. But the scope of possible experience has changed because we can see the expansion of the universe, we can see the cosmic background radiation, and we can construct detailed mathematical models which make predictions about what we should observe, and we have expanded the domain of experience. Now, okay, any scientist would agree with that, but what they wouldn't agree with is that, or not necessarily, is that you can expand the realm of experience in consciousness, right? Wilbur has this very concise...
Through meditation and other exercises?
Yeah, and in The Marriage of Sense and Soul, Wilbur makes a very nice, concise argument for how contemplative modalities like meditation actually correspond to the three fundamental pillars of scientific rigor, which he lists off as an exemplar, an injunction, an apprehension, and then falsification by a community of the adequate. So the injunction is do this, like the apprehension is if you do this, you will observe that. And then falsification by a community of the adequate is when people who have a good enough background in evaluating this kind of thing and experience in that terrain can evaluate your findings. And that's what makes something science. Science is not a body of belief. It is not a metaphysical scheme. It is a method for the critique and reformulation of knowledge. And Wilbur says, real meditative disciplines answer to those criteria. And I think that's very important. It's a very important observation.
Are you proposing kind of an answer to the despair question of the human living in the society as a problem of possibility, not seeing possibility, or these kind of metaphysical practices as an answer to the despair problem?
The blunt answer is no. The more mercurial and potentially post hoc answer is, if so, then it's the workings of the preconscious aspects of the mind organizing what's being said. Because you make a good point. What I'm saying is relevant to that, but I had the feeling, just as the conversation passed back off to you, that this is going on a tangent, and we need to get back to the despair question about how to live in the world. And I think it is relevant, because I think part of the despair of life in any matrix is an artificially delimited horizon of possibility. And I think that is connected to the existential concept of bad faith, like we were saying the other day, where we kind of indoctrinate ourselves, or we give ourselves a kind of entrapping reinforcement wherein we come to believe, I can't leave this person, I can't check a different career, and in fact you can. And the actual scope of your freedom is larger than what you will allow yourself to believe or to understand.
But bad faith is definitely a big part of bad faith is the economic realities of living under capitalism, right?
Part of it.
Why don't a lot of people change their jobs? Because... Yeah,
it's not just fear. But I do think that, look, there are harsh economic realities that make it frightening to dislocate yourself from sources of stability. And that's not just about the contemporary capitalist world. That's about like, okay, I live by this river. We've been fishing here successfully for a long time. If you change entails risk, but independently of the fact that change entails risk, there is the fact that there's this mechanism whereby we adopt a set of axiomatic beliefs, and then perception is a highly selective process. Some things we see, others we forget, and we create these self-reinforcing feedback loops which construct a model of reality that is in keeping with our cherished presuppositions. And that's how people trap themselves in a prison of their own mind.
Okay.
Or on a certain level. There's another sense of trapping yourself in the prison of your own mind that has to do with something more universal, which is samsara.
So the answer is, I don't want to say hope. That's too gross. But like having some sort of possibility for creating a different future than what you feel constrains you.
Yeah, have you ever heard that phrase that gets memed a lot in a society where the possibility of all adventure has been destroyed? The only adventure left is to destroy society.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's something to that, although, I'm not advocating the destruction of society. I think that, there's no going backwards. The only way through is forward.
By backwards, you mean this idea of returning to some sort of pre-industrial hunter-gatherer system or something?
Not just that, but as the system develops, it creates conditions wherein previous versions of the system, the type of existence that was possible within previous versions of the system is no longer possible because the world that supported that is gone and can't be brought back, at least not within historically meaningful stretches of time.
Yeah, the hunter-gatherer thing is impossible now, right?
Yeah, because, look, let me put it this way. 90% of the biomass of all large animal species is humans and domesticated animals. Okay, so being a hunter-gatherer in an environment like that it's not going to work. Maybe there are isolated pockets of the planet. And besides, look,
like the Amazon.
I'm not trying to sound like an anarcho-primitivist. I mean, this is one example of a potentially, and I don't even think that's necessarily a better condition, because in those times there was rigid social hierarchies that could not be altered. There was like very specific like roles that were like given to you in virtue of being a man or a woman or part of a caste or things like that.
Was that bad faith? Or was that kind of something more predicated on the need of your social group to survive?
Look, all of the problems of a given period of history arise from the solutions to problems that other people have come up with.
It's like the Gödel's incompleteness thing?
Yeah. Wilbur has this whole kind of soft teleology, soft systems theoretic teleology, where he talks about how it's toward the end of sex, ecology, spirituality, and he says every holon is either incomplete or uncertain. So he's borrowing a concept from Gödel, and purists would say that this is a misapplication of Gödel. There are books about the ways that people unjustifiably appropriate Gödel. Gödel's theorem, by the way, for anyone who's curious, is something that came up because basically Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead were trying to come up with an axiomatic system that could allow for the reduction of all of mathematics to logic. And Gödel came along and showed that that was impossible for reasons I won't get into. But some people, it got to be really popular in literature, sociology, psychology, all kinds of other disciplines. People saw in the incompleteness theorem a pattern that they thought could be generalized to understand different types of systems. And people say that that's illegitimate, but people also say, hey, you shouldn't use the word evolution if it doesn't refer to random genetic change. And that, but I think the word evolution can be used to understand the development of consciousness and culture and stuff like that, and it does make a good point. Same for the incompleteness theorem. I like Wilbur's thing. Anyway, he says every stage in the development of the system reconciles problems, but then the what it creates new contradictions, because if a system becomes complete, then it will necessarily have a contradiction, and so then the only way is for it to continue evolving. Mm-hmm. And he says, this can only go on forever, which is why he says all these IOUs, which are kind of humorously and playfully simultaneously incomplete or uncertain, and like an IOU, like I owe a debt to the universe, can only be redeemed in emptiness or in infinity. And so the system must continue to evolve, intensify in complexity and consciousness forever. And there's something really beautiful about that, because it creates an unlimited horizon of possibility. But
yeah,
we get back to the despair thing.
Yeah. So how do we solve this?
Well, look,
how should I live? How can I live? What can I grasp? What can I use to navigate this world?
Before we get into that, let me restate, maybe in my own words, why the dystopia of this. And because I do feel that there are a lot of intensely dystopian things about the world that we live in. If you had gone back in time, 200 years, and said we were going to cut down all the trees and we're going to pave over everything with concrete so we could then roll around in these rubber wheels, that would sound appalling. And that's just one of the most elementary details of the world as it exists. Forget about the massive distortion of information for the purpose of large-scale social manipulation that people just take for granted in the news. Forget about the subversion of the democratic choices of other countries by the intelligence apparatus of the United States. Forget about the systemic exploitation of people who are in a position of disadvantage. It's terrible shit that is the product of human decisions, and it isn't necessary or inevitable.
Or part of nature.
Yeah. People like to say, oh, well, the inequalities that exist in society are just the fact that there are winners and losers. And yeah, there are winners and losers, but this is a lot worse than it could be. And it's worse than it could be because of the ways that those who are in a position to leverage the system in their favor have pushed in particularly hideous and cruel and unsustainable ways. Mm-hmm. I hear people triumphantly say, it's working, because over the course of the past 150 years, the average global income has gone up from $1 a day to $2 a day. And that's cool.
Oh, joy.
And it's cool that there's less infant mortality. It's cool that, people don't just die of fucking famines because weather comes along and destroys their crop yield. And it's cool
or
that
polio or cholera.
Yeah, and it's
people still do die of that, but
and it's cool that in a post-industrial liberal democratic country, everyone has, in theory at least, everyone has the rights of being a human being. But at the same time,
more or less,
we spend a huge part of our waking life staring at this box, which has no purpose other than to hypnotize us, turn us into passive consumers, instill social norms that make us more obedient and conformist.
We really mean to instill these things, because people don't realize how, when you watch TV, something, we're not talking about Netflix or something where you don't have to watch advertisements, but people don't even realize how pervasive these things are. The advertisements are kind of like 50% of the show. What did you say before? They don't sell. It's not about the TV show. It's about how much advertising time you can get.
Advertiser. There's a language. They say there's content and there's filler, and the content, like they actually use in like television speak, is the advertising, and the filler is the show, and the product is the audience, not the show. The audiences are being sold, and that's become. It's like that on steroids now. We've moved beyond. I need to think more carefully about this, but I think we've moved beyond the propaganda model of the media that was elaborated by Chomsky in Manufacturing Consent, because that's just a relatively simple scenario in which you have concentrated sectors of private capital, which, determine the interest of what's on the news and the filters with the state pronouncements and all that, and everything gets filtered down. Because now we have something else. We have a situation in which everyone is trapped in a prison of their own mind because of the intense power of metadata and extremely sophisticated algorithms, where they can serve you exactly what you will already agree with. That's a different situation. It's a more insidious situation.
People definitely don't see it. I had a conversation with my father about advertising. I was like, yeah, Dad, I don't watch TV because I don't want all these advertisements in my brain. I have a certain amount of time in the day, and I don't want to just sit around watching fucking advertisements. And his defense to this was was not vitriolic, but he was like, oh, I watch it, but, they're not going to serve me. If I don't want to buy the product, I'm not going to buy the product. And let me tell you something about my dad. He loves buying shit. He's a hoarder. All he does is buy more stuff that he doesn't need. And that's a lot of Americans do that. A lot of American consumers just buy what they don't need. And it's this thing, you don't realize what's being done to you when you consume, when you ingest all of this media that's telling you what to do.
Well, I want to round this around to thinking about the question, which is, how does one find peace? How does one cultivate oneself? How does one lead a spiritually meaningful existence in the presence of this ecologically unsustainable, historically unjust, and mind-destroyingly
manipulative?
Awful. Yeah. How? Well, I thought about this, and have you ever heard that phrase, wisdom tells me I am nothing, love tells me I am everything, and between these two my life moves? Well, part of my response to this is the planet is dying. There is a situation in which there's an information infrastructure in which all of the wisdom of all of time is here, and we're almost on the verge of being able to become an interplanetary species, and there is this tremendous promise. And we occupy a place between destruction and something wonderful enough that it used to be the exclusive province of eschatology.
And also this nominal immortality, with cryostasis. And I saw something about scientists making advances that would lead to human beings having a longer life expectancy.
Yeah, some scientists think we could turn off the gene or the sequence in DNA or whatever the fuck it is.
Yeah, genetic manipulation.
Because you don't need to age. That's an instruction that is sent out in your cells.
Wow.
Yeah, that's not atrophy. That's not entropy. That is something that nature has designed in order for one population to go so another population can come in. Of course, these things can all become unspeakably horrible, because if you start being able to manipulate genes, then who's going to have that? No, who's going to have it? The people who can afford it. And so, the aristocracy has always thought that it was special. But in a post-genetic, post-singularity world, they could be. There could be, Harari writes about this, in Sapiens and in Homo Deus. We could reach a point where there is an unbridgeable gap between the global poor and these post-human super beings.
Elysium?
Yeah, like Elysium.
The movie.
But worse.
Damn.
So, look, and when I say that we're on the verge of like a great possible future, I don't just mean, a naive transhumanist eschatology. Because look, that all those answers presuppose that there is no reincarnation, there is no soul, and I'm not sold on that. There could be some kind of naturalistic ontology of which consciousness is apart and where there is a greater reality that we participate in ways that the default cultural ontology doesn't generally acknowledge. You know, like, you know what I mean. But I do look. We could get off this planet. We could enter the life of the universe. We could participate in dialogue with other intelligent beings, or
extraterrestrial.
Or we could nuke ourselves into oblivion. And we've come really close to it. We have come really close to it. You know, there was that time in the Cuban Missile Crisis where you had two guys who had the keys turned and the third Russian guy in the submarine didn't want to turn it. There was a time when the Russians thought that this Aurora Borealis satellite was an intercontinental ballistic missile, and all the people
what
who
paranoia
were like, do it, launch. And he just decided not to because he didn't buy into it. Like, we have been so close to annihilation so many times that I kind of like to joke almost as a fanciful ontology. You know how McKenna would make up sort of fanciful ontologies, like his fractal soliton of improbability, which is about like a world where there was no Christianity? As a kind of joke, like I like to say that in the sense that there's this quantum immortality thing where if the Wheeler Everett multiverse is true, and you know the correct interpretation of quantum mechanics is that there's an unlimited number of universes that are described by all the different probabilities. Maybe what we inhabit is a quantum immortal timeline because we should have destroyed ourselves so many times that we're left. And I say that fancifully and kind of to make a rhetorical point, because we are close to the razor's edge of our own destruction. Okay, but how do you have hope and how do you have peace? Okay, here's my take on it. Number one, have a community of people who share your values. Now, this does not mean...
That's hard.
That does not mean insularize yourself with people who agree with you in every way, because I think, Plato says that philosophy is only possible in dialogue. And I think that philosophy, in a large sense, of the love of wisdom, in which we confront the unknown, in which we undermine our own presuppositions, is a genuinely spiritual process that is important to a meaningful human life. Mm-hmm. And, I'm not saying to insularize yourself, but you do need... Because
other people. You need people. You need these networks. You need support.
You need a spiritual practice. You need to stay true to the things, to your own true will, to the impetus of your being. And you need to think outside of the box in a way to live the type of life that would be spiritually authentic, a type of life that answers to the real potentials of what human beings are and can be, even in the midst of a world of pervasive insanity.
Dystopian hellscape.
Yeah, dystopian hellscape, sure. And right now, off the top of my head, maybe that's the best. Learn spiritual disciplines. Learn to meditate. Learn to control your mind. The Buddha said there's nothing more unwieldy than a untrained mind. Master your mind. Come to know how the mind works. Cultivate yourself philosophically. Develop your own views. Discover what you love most and live in terms of that. Nietzsche says that you should take your values and you should hold that over you as a banner that you don't deviate from. Like, how an army marches under a banner? Like, you should have that level of commitment to that.
I want to play devil's advocate, of course, and
sure.
A lot of these spiritual disciplines require an insane amount of time that is not available to most working people.
People do it.
Yes. Especially if you have a family.
Look, there have been years at a time where we ourselves have been like less than working class, and through a feat of the help of other people who are cooperating with us and care about us, and our own ingenuity and kind of creating our own businesses and like building our life around that, we've managed to meditate like 8 hours a day. And if you're wondering why the fuck would someone meditate for 8 hours a day, if you're trying to really go there with a practice, then that's the way to do it, and we'll talk about that in another episode. And that wasn't a position of privilege. We made it possible, and that's not. And I hope it's not just the argument that says, "Hey, it doesn't matter how unjust a society is; people can crawl to the top if they're determined enough," because that's not fair, and I think that distorts something that's very important. But you can. It's possible. We're lucky to live in a society where you won't be gunned down in the street for saying that you think Trump should be crucified. And that's why people kind of look down on us. Like I've heard that in South America, they think we're like fucking weak because they fight against regimes that'll kill you if you're resisting them, right? But we can't even be bothered to put down our lattes and go in the street and protest most of the time.
Yeah. And I'm going to go on what you said. Adorno was always a critique of American society and how people spent their time, How does the worker spend his time, leisure time? Because it's a big chunk of your time is leisure, right? And
and this is the first time in history that people have had this much leisure.
I don't know about that. They've also said that
I've heard that
feudal peasants had less
I've
vacation
heard that
time.
too. Well, look, I'll say this. Things are changing faster than we give it credit for. For most of European history, if you were another religion and you displayed it openly, you would be brutally killed on the spot as a public display of how no one should defy the state and the religion that backs it. You know what I mean? Now, the fucking satanic temple is fucking suing the government all the time to try and put a giant Baphomet in a courthouse. And yeah, people might make fun of them, and some people might ostracize them in their private life. But you can fucking do it. And in the past 100 years, like women, black people, and these things are not done. But like from after millennia of subjugation and exploitation, and it's just like the technology thing. In the last episode, we were saying that 100 years ago, the primary technology driving the global economy was horses pulling carts. And then we had the combustion engine and the fucking computer and airplanes like that. Mm-hmm. And it seems glacial because we're like mayflies. Mm-hmm. But there is the mind of humanity is trying to find its way. And I think this is the phrase from the Ceph material by Jane Roberts that I really like. Ceph, the entity that she's saying that she's channeling, says that history is the flawed apprentice work of a master artist in the making. So now it is 57 minutes into the hour. This is. Do you have any concluding thoughts?
There is hope.
One can. You know what Cornel West says? He says that hope is impossible in the absence of despair. And I think that tuning in to the injustice of the world can give you hope because it gives a sense of a possibility of an adventure. There is something to do, and you can do it. So let the despair, let the fear fuel the hope, because ultimately there's a non-duality of hope and fear. They are different sides of the same coin. So inflame the hope by not shrinking from the fear. Okay, yes. So I am Nathaniel Voss.
Shinobi Depp.
This has been another episode of Ontological Shock. We will see you next time.